The flight attendant glanced at the screen, then looked back at Jason Statham with a practiced, polite smile. "I'm sorry, sir," she said calmly, tapping the tablet in her hand. "This seat isn't available." Jason looked down at his boarding pass. "First class. C2A." He looked back up, not annoyed, not confused. "Oh," he replied quietly. The attendant leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "First-class seating is reserved for priority passengers only." There was no accusation in her tone. No hostility. Just certainty. Around them, the boarding gate buzzed with noise, rolling suitcases, announcements echoing overhead, passengers inching forward in line. Jason didn't sigh. Didn't explain who he was. Didn't ask for a manager. He simply nodded once. "All right," he said. That response alone caught a few people off guard. Most passengers argued. Some demanded upgrades. Others raised their voices, insisting mistakes had been made. Jason did none of that. He stepped aside, allowing the line to keep moving, as if the decision didn't matter to him at all. But something about the moment felt off. The attendant glanced at the screen again. The name still sat there. Statham J. She hesitated just for a second, then shook it off. "Please wait here," she said, motioning toward the side. Jason waited. "Come." Still unbothered. A man behind him whispered to his wife. "Why does he look familiar?" She shrugged. "No idea." Minutes passed. The supervisor arrived, sharp uniform, clipped tone, eyes trained to keep everything on schedule. "There's an issue with this boarding pass," the supervisor said, barely looking up. "To avoid delaying other passengers, we'll reseat you." Jason met his eyes. "Whatever works best," he replied. That answer surprised the supervisor. Most people fought back. Jason didn't. As he turned away from first class, walking calmly toward the main cabin, no one realized what had just happened. This wasn't a mistake that would end at the gate. This was the kind of moment that quietly rewrites careers. And in less than 30 minutes, everyone on that aircraft would understand exactly why. The aircraft stood quietly at the gate, its polished body reflecting the morning light as passengers continued to board. Inside, the cabin was alive with movement. Overhead bins opened and shut in soft thuds. Flight attendants moved smoothly up and down the aisle, guiding passengers, answering questions, offering practice smiles. The scent of recycled air mixed with coffee and cologne, the familiar atmosphere of a full international flight. Jason Statham walked down the jet bridge alone. No assistant. No security. No announcement. He wore a simple jacket, dark jeans, and carried a small travel bag slung casually over his shoulder. To anyone glancing quickly, he looked like any other frequent traveler, calm, focused, unhurried. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant scanned his boarding pass. The screen blinked. She paused. Then she smiled politely and stepped slightly to the side. "Welcome aboard, sir. Please proceed for the moment." Jason nodded and entered the cabin. First class was only a few steps ahead. Wider seats, soft lighting, a quiet contrast to the busy energy behind it. He stopped at row 2 and looked at the seat number. 2A. Exactly as printed. He waited, allowing the attendant to catch up. "I believe this is my seat," he said calmly, holding out the boarding pass again. She reviewed it more closely this time. Her fingers hovered over the tablet, scrolling. "I see the assignment," she said carefully, choosing her words. "But there's a note here." Jason tilted his head slightly. "A note?" "Yes," she replied. "Some first-class seats are temporarily restricted unless confirmed at the gate." Jason considered that for a moment. "All right," he said. "What's the best way to confirm it?" The attendant hesitated. Behind them, another passenger in first class cleared his throat, clearly eager to settle in. "We'll need to involve the cabin supervisor," she said. "It shouldn't take long." "No rush," Jason replied. That answer again felt unexpected. Most travelers showed impatience the moment something went wrong. Jason simply stepped aside, giving space to the crew and other passengers. The supervisor arrived shortly after. He was efficient, confident, clearly used to handling pressure. One look at the tablet and his jaw tightened slightly. "Sir," he said, keeping his voice professional, "this seat requires additional authorization." Jason listened without interrupting. "To keep boarding on schedule," the supervisor continued, "we'd like to seat you elsewhere for now." Jason glanced down the aisle. Passengers were watching. Not openly, just enough to notice. "Where would that be?" he asked. "An equivalent seat in the main cabin," the supervisor replied. Jason paused for a moment. Then he nodded. "If that helps things move faster," he said calmly. I'm fine with that. The supervisor blinked. That wasn't the reaction he was used to. Jason turned and walked down the aisle toward the economy section, weaving past passengers still stowing bags and adjusting seats. A few heads turned. Someone whispered, "Isn't that?" "No," another replied quickly. "Can't be." Jason reached his assigned seat and sat down quietly, placing his bag under the seat in front of him. No complaint. No explanation. No demand. But from the front of the aircraft, a crew member glanced back, uneasy, because the system still showed the same name. And somewhere beyond the cabin walls, a message had already been sent. One that would soon force everyone involved to take a closer look at the decision they had just made. The cabin doors closed with a muted thud. Seatbelt signs illuminated overhead, and the low hum of the aircraft filled the space as final checks began. Passengers settled in, some already lost in their screens, others adjusting pillows and stretching their legs. Jason Statham sat quietly in his seat near the middle of the aircraft. He opened a book, flipping a page as if nothing unusual had happened. From the outside, he looked like just another traveler waiting for takeoff. But toward the front of the plane, the mood was different. The cabin supervisor stood near the galley, tablet in hand, reviewing the passenger manifest once more. His brow furrowed slightly as he scrolled. The name was still there. Statham J. First class allocation pending. He frowned. "That's odd," he muttered under his breath. A senior flight attendant leaned over. "Problem?" "Not exactly," the supervisor replied. "But that seat shouldn't still be open." First class remained unusually quiet. One premium seat sat empty, perfectly arranged, untouched. The supervisor tapped his screen again, refreshing the system. No change. Meanwhile, a junior attendant walked down the aisle offering water to passengers. When she reached Jason's row, she paused for half a second. "Would you like some water, sir?" she asked. "Yes, please." "Thank you," Jason replied warmly. She handed him the cup, then glanced at the name on his boarding pass still visible in his hand. Her eyes widened just slightly. She kept walking, but her steps slowed as she reached the galley. "His name," she whispered to another attendant. "It's Jason Statham." The other attendant scoffed softly. "That's not possible." "That's what the screen says," she replied. Up front, the captain's voice crackled briefly over the intercom, a standard announcement about a minor delay. Nothing unusual. But in the cockpit, a separate message had just appeared. "Passenger of interest on board. Confirm identity and booking classification." The captain raised an eyebrow. "Passenger of interest?" he repeated. He tapped the message, reading further. "Brand consultant. Executive relations. Discretion advised." Back in the cabin, the supervisor felt a tightness in his chest. He hadn't been rude. He hadn't raised his voice. He had followed procedure. Still, something didn't sit right. He looked down the aisle toward the middle rows. Jason sat calmly, turning another page of his book, completely unaware, or at least appearing to be. A few passengers nearby whispered quietly. "That guy looks like someone famous." "Yeah, but why would he be back here?" Jason didn't notice them, or pretended not to. The aircraft remained at the gate longer than expected. Then the captain stepped out of the cockpit. He scanned the cabin carefully before approaching the supervisor. "We need a quick word," he said quietly. The supervisor followed him toward the galley. In a hushed tone, the captain spoke. "There's a note attached to one of the passengers. Corporate level." The supervisor swallowed. "Which passenger?" The captain didn't answer right away. He simply turned and looked down the aisle. Straight at Jason Statham. At that moment, the tension in the cabin shifted. Subtle, invisible, but undeniable. Something important was about to happen. And for the crew, the next few minutes would determine far more than seating arrangements. The aircraft remained at the gate longer than expected. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. Engines hummed at idle, cabin lights glowed softly, and passengers waited with the familiar patience of frequent travelers. But inside the plane, the atmosphere had subtly changed. It wasn't panic. It wasn't chaos. It was awareness. Up front, the cabin supervisor stood motionless near the galley, his tablet resting against his chest. He had handled thousands of flights, thousands of passengers. Delays, complaints, upgrades, all routine. This felt different. The captain re-entered the cockpit, leaving the supervisor alone with his thoughts. The message replayed in his mind. Corporate level note. Discretion advised. He glanced again toward the middle rows. Jason Statham sat quietly, his posture relaxed, one ankle crossed over the other. The book in his hands lay open, though he hadn't turned a page in a while. His attention seemed focused but not tense. Around him, passengers were beginning to notice. Not openly. Not dramatically. Just small reactions. A woman 2 rows ahead leaned toward her companion. "Is it just me," she whispered, "or does that guy look familiar?" Her companion squinted, then shook his head. "Probably just someone who looks like him." A man across the aisle glanced once, then twice. "No way," he murmured. Jason remained still, completely removed from the quiet speculation happening around him. At the front of the aircraft, first class sat in pristine silence. One seat, wide, empty, untouched, seemed to draw more attention than any passenger. The supervisor finally broke the stillness. He approached a senior attendant and spoke quietly. "Double-check the manifest," he said. "Every note. Every flag." She nodded and moved quickly. Moments later she returned. "It's confirmed," she whispered. "He's listed as an external advisor. Brand relations. Executive access." The supervisor exhaled slowly. So it wasn't a mistake. He hadn't denied a random passenger. He had delayed someone with influence, not because of ego but because of procedure. Still, procedure suddenly felt fragile. The supervisor looked down the aisle again. Jason closed his book and rested it on his lap. He glanced out the window briefly, watching the ground crew move equipment below. Unbothered. Unimpressed. Unconcerned. That calm unsettled the crew more than any argument ever could. Another message appeared on the supervisor's tablet. "Executive boarding imminent." He stiffened. Before he could react, movement at the aircraft door caught everyone's attention. The jet bridge connected again. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks. Then footsteps echoed in the forward cabin. 3 individuals boarded, sharply dressed, confident, moving with purpose. They didn't scan the cabin like tourists. They walked as if they already knew where they were going. The lead executive paused near the cockpit, spoke briefly with the captain, then turned toward the cabin. His eyes locked instantly on Jason. Relief crossed his face. He walked down the aisle without hesitation. Passengers watched silently as he stopped beside Jason's seat. "Mr. Statham," the executive said warmly, "I'm glad we caught you before departure." Jason looked up and smiled faintly. "Seems like a busy morning," he replied. The executive nodded. "It usually is, when systems don't align." Nearby passengers froze. The whispers stopped. The supervisor felt his pulse quicken. The executive gestured gently toward the front. "May we speak for a moment?" Jason stood without urgency. "Of course." As they walked forward together, every eye followed them. Not because of celebrity. Not because of drama. But because something important was unfolding, quietly. In the galley, the executive spoke softly. "We weren't informed you'd be flying today," he said. "That's on us." Jason waved it off. "I boarded as a passenger," he replied evenly. "That part went exactly as expected." The supervisor shifted uneasily. "I don't have concerns about the seating," Jason continued. "But I do have questions about consistency." The executive nodded. "So do we." They stepped aside, allowing boarding to resume, but nothing felt routine anymore. Back in the cabin, passengers sat straighter. Crew members moved with heightened focus. The empty first-class seat no longer felt like a perk. Felt like a test. And as the doors prepared to close once more, one thing became clear to everyone on board. This flight was no longer about where someone sat. It was about how decisions were made, and who noticed when they weren't. The aircraft doors closed once again, sealing the cabin in a calm, controlled silence. From their seats, passengers could sense that something unusual was happening, not because of raised voices or hurried movements, but because of how carefully everyone was behaving. At the front of the plane, the executive stood beside Jason Statham, speaking in a low, respectful tone. "I want to be very clear," he said. "This situation isn't about inconvenience." Jason nodded slightly. "I understand," he replied. "That's why I stayed seated." The executive glanced toward the cockpit, then back to Jason. "You were listed today as a routine traveler," he continued. "But you're also recorded as a long-term consultant for our aviation group. That information didn't sync properly." Jason smiled faintly. "Systems miss details," he said. "People notice how those details are handled." The executive didn't disagree. He gestured gently toward the cabin supervisor, who stood nearby, listening closely. "This is our cabin supervisor," the executive said. "He followed procedure, but we're reviewing whether that procedure reflects our values." The supervisor straightened instinctively. Jason turned to him. "I don't believe you acted with bad intent," Jason said calmly. "You made a decision based on limited information." The supervisor let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. "I tried to keep things moving." "And you did," Jason replied. "But speed shouldn't erase fairness." Those words hung in the air. The executive nodded. "Exactly." Up and down the cabin, crew members were listening, not out of fear but focus. This wasn't a reprimand. It was a lesson unfolding in real time. The executive continued. "Mr. Statham has worked with us for years," he said. "Not as a spokesperson, but as someone who evaluates how passengers experience our service." A murmur rippled quietly through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances. Jason Statham. Not just a passenger. Not just a familiar face. The executive wasn't finished. "He's advised on training, brand perception and service consistency," he said. "Today wasn't scheduled as an evaluation, but it became one." Jason raised a hand gently. "I didn't intend that," he said. "I boarded as anyone would." The executive smiled. "And that's why it matters." He turned to the supervisor. "When we treat someone differently because they don't look important, we risk failing the people we'll never recognize." The supervisor nodded slowly. "I see that now." Jason glanced down the aisle, toward the middle rows where he had been seated moments earlier. "Some of the most respectful moments today," he said, "came from crew members who had no idea who I was." The executive followed his gaze. "I'd like to know who they were," he said. A junior attendant stepped forward hesitantly. "She handled water service," the supervisor said. "Stayed consistent. Calm." Jason smiled at her. "That consistency is what passengers remember," he said. The executive made a brief note on his phone. "Thank you," he said to her. No applause followed. No public praise. Just acknowledgement. The executive turned back to Jason. "We'd like to offer you your assigned seat now," he said. Jason paused. Then he shook his head gently. "I'm comfortable where I am," he replied. The point has already been made. That response surprised everyone, again. The executive respected it. "As you wish," he said. He addressed the cabin once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience," he announced calmly. "We'll be departing shortly." As he returned toward the cockpit, the supervisor remained standing, thoughtful. Jason extended his hand. The supervisor shook it firmly. "Thank you for handling this with professionalism," Jason said. "Moments like these shape careers." The supervisor nodded. "I won't forget it." Jason returned to his seat, not in first class, but among the passengers who had watched the entire moment unfold. As he sat down, a quiet realization spread through the cabin. True authority doesn't arrive loudly. It reveals itself, calmly, clearly, and without needing recognition. And for everyone on board, the lesson was already traveling far beyond the runway. The aircraft finally pushed back from the gate. Outside the windows, the terminal slowly drifted away as the engines increased their steady hum. Inside the cabin, the earlier tension dissolved into something quieter, reflection. Passengers settled in again, but the energy had changed. People weren't talking about delays anymore. They weren't focused on legroom or meals. They were replaying what they had just witnessed. Jason Statham sat back in his seat, fastening his seatbelt as the safety demonstration began. Around him, passengers stole quick glances, not with excitement but curiosity. He wasn't acting different. He wasn't enjoying attention. He was simply present. At the front of the aircraft, the cabin supervisor stood near the galley, hands clasped loosely in front of him. His expression wasn't defensive. It was thoughtful. The executive rejoined him quietly. "This wasn't a failure," the executive said in a low voice. "It was a blind spot." The supervisor nodded. "I followed the rulebook," he replied. "But I didn't question whether the rule made sense in the moment." "That awareness," the executive said, "is what separates management from leadership." The supervisor absorbed that. Nearby, the junior attendant who had served Jason earlier adjusted her service cart, unaware she was being observed. The executive glanced at her. "She didn't know who he was," he said. "But she treated him exactly the same." The supervisor nodded again. "That stood out to him," he replied. As the plane reached cruising altitude, service began. The cabin supervisor made a deliberate decision. He didn't assign the junior attendant to first class. He didn't single her out publicly. Instead, he asked her to assist with coordinating service timing across cabins, A role that required judgment, calm, and trust. She accepted without question. Jason noticed. Not because it was announced, but because consistency always reveals itself. Later, the supervisor approached Jason quietly. "I wanted you to know," he said. "We're reviewing how seat restrictions are communicated, not just enforced." Jason looked up. "That's good," he replied. "Policies should guide people, not replace thinking." The supervisor smiled faintly. "I won't forget that." Jason nodded. Across the aisle, a passenger leaned toward another and whispered, "He could have made a scene." "Yes," the other replied softly. "But he didn't need to." The aircraft moved smoothly through the clouds. In the cockpit, the captain reviewed the flight plan, then glanced back briefly through the open door. He had flown countless executives, celebrities, and VIPs. Very few left an impression like this. During the flight, the executive compiled notes, not about names but behaviors. Who stayed professional. Who reacted defensively. Who adapted. This wasn't about consequences. It was about alignment. Midway through the flight, the executive returned to Jason's row. "I want to thank you," he said quietly. "You could have escalated this instantly." Jason closed his book. "That wouldn't have shown you anything new," he replied. "Pressure reveals what systems are really built on." The executive nodded. "We'll be adjusting training," he said. "More emphasis on judgment. Less on rigid hierarchy." "That's a good start," Jason replied. As the hours passed, the cabin relaxed fully. Passengers laughed again. Crew members moved with renewed confidence. Not because they were afraid, but because clarity had replaced uncertainty. When the plane began its descent, the supervisor made one final decision. He addressed the crew privately. "What happened today wasn't about status," he said. "It was about awareness. And we're better for seeing it. No blame. No defensiveness. Just responsibility." As the aircraft touched down and taxied toward the gate, passengers applauded lightly, not for the landing but out of habit. Still, a few claps carried something extra. Respect. Jason stood when the seatbelt sign turned off, retrieving his bag. As he stepped into the aisle, the junior attendant looked up at him. "Thank you for your patience today," she said sincerely. Jason smiled. "Thank you for your professionalism," he replied. They meant different things, and both mattered. At the door, the executive shook Jason's hand. "This flight gave us clarity we didn't expect," he said. Jason nodded. "Those are usually the most useful ones." As he stepped onto the jet bridge, Jason blended back into the flow of travelers, just another passenger moving forward. Behind him, the crew prepared for the next flight. But something had shifted. Not because someone was embarrassed. Not because someone was punished. But because everyone had seen, clearly, that true standards aren't tested when things go right. They're revealed when no one thinks it matters. The aircraft glided smoothly through the clouds, the sun streaming through the windows in soft, golden slivers. Inside, the cabin was quiet. Passengers adjusted in their seats, reading or resting, while the crew moved efficiently, carrying out their duties with precision and care. The earlier tension that had gripped the flight was gone, replaced by something subtler, a sense of awareness. Jason Statham sat back in his seat, relaxed, his presence calm and unassuming. He hadn't needed to make a scene. He hadn't needed to assert himself loudly or demand recognition. Yet, in the quiet way he carried himself, he had communicated more than any words could have. The crew noticed. Not immediately, perhaps, but in the small shifts of attention and behavior that followed. The cabin supervisor, who had been tense earlier, now moved with purpose and confidence, aware of the importance of decisions made in the moment. The junior attendant, who had served Jason with quiet professionalism, now carried herself differently, knowing that consistency and fairness mattered, even when no one was watching. This flight had not been about celebrity status. It had not been about power or authority. It had been about character, about how ordinary moments reveal the extraordinary nature of people. Jason's calm approach had allowed everyone to reflect on their own actions. The supervisor realized that following procedure without thinking could lead to missed opportunities to do what was right. The attendants understood that professionalism isn't measured by recognition but by consistency. And the passengers, though unaware of the full story, sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle respect that comes from witnessing integrity in action. As the plane descended toward its destination, Jason stood, gathered his belongings and moved toward the exit. He didn't hurry. He didn't seek attention. He simply walked with quiet confidence, a reminder that influence isn't about dominance, it's about presence, consistency, and awareness. At the jet bridge, the senior executive approached him once more. No fanfare, no unnecessary formality. Just a firm handshake and a nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you," the executive said. And that was enough. No public announcement. No display of power. Just recognition of the quiet but meaningful impact Jason had created through his actions. As Jason stepped off the plane, the crew returned to their duties, but their perspective had shifted. Decisions would be made differently from that day forward. Not out of fear, not for appearances, but because they had witnessed the importance of fairness, awareness, and respect in action. The moral of the story was clear. True leadership and influence do not require loud words or dramatic gestures. They are revealed through patience, calm judgment, and the consistent demonstration of character. Moments that seem small, seating assignments, brief interactions, routine decisions, are often the ones that reveal the most about who we are. In the end, respect is not given based on status or recognition. It is earned through actions that reflect integrity, thoughtfulness, and awareness of others. Character manifests quietly, but its impact resonates far beyond the immediate moment. As the aircraft reached the gate and the passengers began to disembark, the lessons of the flight lingered silently in the minds of those on board. A subtle reminder that the choices we make, even in ordinary circumstances, can ripple outward in ways we may never see. Some lessons arrive with fanfare. Others arrive quietly in the form of calm, deliberate action. This was one of the latter, a reminder that influence is not measured by what people see, but by what they learn from how we behave when no one expects it. And as Jason walked away into the terminal, he left behind more than a name or a moment of recognition. He left behind an example, quiet, unassuming, and powerful, that would guide the people who had witnessed it long after the flight had ended. The aircraft doors closed. Passengers moved on. But the impact of the day remained. A lesson in integrity, consistency, and the subtle power of character had been delivered, and it would resonate far beyond the cabin of a single plane.